So I'll just pass the floor to Professor Sparks. Yeah.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for all coming on such an auspicious day. We have COVID here too, so I understand how you feel about being in more or less in isolation from each other, I suppose. Okay, so let me just get my screen up. Now, here we are. So today I'm going to talk about how to write a thesis and what happens next, namely the examination. This is largely going to be aimed at doctoral students who have, and indeed MPhil students who have begun to reach that stage of their work. But I think it would be useful for everybody to know what's coming down the turnpike, as the Americans say. So first of all, as I say, you've already either embarked on or you're about to embark on your thesis. So I want to ask, what really is a thesis? It sort of looms as a sort of a mountain that everybody, at least mine, loomed as a mountain that I had to climb, and I think probably most people have one version or another of that feeling. Secondly, how do you organize a thesis? And then how do you write the thesis? What must you be sure to do, and what must you be sure not to do in producing a thesis? And then how will it be examined? I've given this talk to my own doctoral students on an individual basis, and indeed I've given it to previous generations of HKBU students. It's really, I suppose it's a reflection on my own rather chaotic production of a PhD thesis. And I should say at the beginning, I don't quite hold the world record for the longest time taken for a PhD thesis. One of my colleagues, a man called Andrew Tolson, when I was at Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, took a year longer than me, but it took me 16 years. So this is really a very strong case of don't do as I did, do as I tell you. Yeah? Don't take too long. The talk seems to have worked in the past. The things that I would wish I'd known at the beginning, it's useful for other people to know before they start. My focus is on the requirements of a doctoral thesis. It's not on the MPhil thesis, because those are slightly different, but there are very many points of overlap with what I say here. But the regulations for an MPhil are different. So I think you know that if you're an MPhil student listening to me, where I quote regulations, look up the university's regulations for the MPhil, because they are significantly different. But much of the process of what you're doing is going to be very similar. So I think there'll be some use to you if you're an MPhil student as well. I'm not going to talk here about formulating research topics, research questions, or about conducting your research. That's a matter for you and your supervisor. I'm going to assume, basically, that you've already gathered your material and that you're writing up. But if you haven't finished gathering the material, then fine. This will still, I hope, be useful. And this, I must stress very strongly. This talk is not a substitute for the advice of your supervisors. If they tell you something different to what I say, follow their advice, not mine. I might disagree with them, but they are your supervisor. They are seeing you on a regular basis. They know more about your work than I do, and you know, they are charged by the university to help you get through the PhD. I'm not. I'm just a part-time member of staff. I was once upon a time, actually, in fact, in one case, I think I still am the supervisor of a HKBU student. But you know, I would expect her to follow my advice, but you must follow the advice of your supervisors. Unless they tell you something contrary to university regulations. University regulations outrank supervisors. Supervisors outrank me. University regulations outrank supervisors. So essentially follow what their advice, but this I hope will not contradict them too much. Where does the thesis stand in the process of getting a doctoral degree? Well, it's the central part of any serious doctoral degree. All of the rest is preparation. In most European systems, it's the whole of the doctoral degree, that all you do is write your thesis. It's changing slightly, but certainly when I was a doctoral student, the only thing I had to do was write my thesis. No coursework, no examinations, no attendance at research seminars was entirely up to you. All I had to do was finish my thesis, and I didn't make a very good job of that for a long time. Here in Hong Kong, the US model is what is followed, and so the thesis is only part of getting a PhD. Hong Kong did initially have the UK model of higher education. Over my time in Baptist, it changed to having a US model, and in my opinion, that's a move, a shift for the best, at least at the doctoral level. I'm not so sure about the undergraduate level, but at the doctoral level, it's certainly a better model. So because it's a US model, you have to complete the coursework requirements before you can present your thesis. Not before you can start your thesis, but before you can present it. Ideally, you would complete the coursework requirements, but the regs don't say you have to. The thesis is by far the most important part of your degree. It's the part that's most under your control. You're not following a syllabus dictated by somebody else. You're not sitting in examination set by somebody else. You have control over what goes into your doctoral thesis. And therefore, it's the part which most reflects your own thoughts and efforts. It's not you repeating what you read from other people, or at least not entirely that. It's you making a contribution. And it's the part which most closely corresponds to the work you will do when you become a scholar. I'm assuming that most of you have the ambition to be university teachers, and you want to be university teachers who are engaged in scholarly research, and the thesis is a training for that. Normally in HKBU, a thesis is written in English, but it's important for those of you who want to write in another language that there is a provision for it to be written in another language, for example, Chinese. So, for example, if you're writing on the development of propaganda films in the early years of the People's Republic of China, you could, I would say you could argue, if you wished, with the university, that this thesis will be a greater contribution to knowledge if you were writing it in Chinese. But you have to have a good reason for that, but it is possible. And I think in practice, Chinese is the major other language about which this is likely to be an issue. What then is this thesis? According to this university, HKBU, and all the others I know of, including, well, I don't know much about US universities, but including Oxford for sure, the thesis shall form an original contribution to knowledge in the given discipline. The originality shall be shown either by the discovery of new facts or theories, or by the demonstration of innovative critical thinking. The thing to note is that a thesis is an original contribution to knowledge. That's what distinguishes a PhD from everything else. And both parts of that phrase are important. You have to produce something that nobody else has done before. Yeah? You have to say something new, discover something new. And you have to establish that it advances knowledge in the field. It's a contribution to knowledge. It's original and a contribution. It advances knowledge in your field. The scope of that original contribution, as defined here, can be very broad. It's designed to encompass everything from the natural sciences, where, let's say, somebody is conducting a physics experiment entirely within a laboratory, through someone who is let's say, a social scientific ethnographer who goes into people's houses to discover what they are, how they're using their PCs, right the way through to people who spend their entire PhD time in the library, critically analyzing texts. So there's no single model for how you do it. Discovery of new facts, that's the physicists. War theories, perhaps the physicists as well, and the social scientists. Innovative critical thinking, that's much more the humanities end of the market. So so don't feel that you have to work in one particular kind of academic inquiry. I mean, I think that certainly for Baptists, Baptists communication and journalism people, they tend towards the social scientific end, not entirely. Some very distinguished members of your faculty are, shall we say, critical of some aspects of social sciences. Not you, Celine. I think probably the people who are working on film tend very much to be at the innovative critical thinking end of the market. And so there's no institutional preference for any topic or any approach. What else is a thesis? Well, it's got a physical being. It's a work of up to 60,000 words in length. That's following the US model of a doctoral thesis, which is relatively short. European theses tend to be much longer. Most Europeans expect about 100,000 words. I wrote 120,000 words and lied that it was 100,000. But you know, it's it's more important part of the PhD in Europe, and it's much more substantial. And indeed, in some European countries, the thesis has to be published as a book before they'll give you the PhD. So really, by international standards, you're getting off lightly with only 60,000 words. Remember also that that's a theoretical maximum. You don't have to write 60,000 words. In practice, many people write more than that, and if they can persuade their supervisor to let them get away with it, then that's what they submit. I'll mention one of the ways that you can get around this later. Other people write shorter theses. I mean, if you think these regulations apply to everyone from the Department of Mathematics through to the film school, and no one in the Department of Mathematics is going to write 60,000 words, maybe half a dozen pages of equations will get a PhD. So, you know, this is a theoretical maximum. 60,000 words probably seems to most of you quite a lot just now. But almost every one of you will find you have too much material, that you're leaving things out rather than trying to pad things out. An important thing to remember, and I'm going to come back to this again and again and again, you're producing a text which will be examined. It's not for your benefit, it's not for anybody else's benefit, it's to satisfy the examiners. Now, because it's a PhD, there's a lot of flexibility in that, but nevertheless, remember that you're going to have it read by some other people who are going to examine it. So my first piece of advice is get a move on. Voltaire, the French Enlightenment thinker, whether he's a philosopher or not is another question, 18th century, said the best is the enemy of the good. He said it in French, but he alleged that he got it from the Italians. The best is the enemy of the good. In other words, perfection is wonderful, but not everybody achieves perfection. And if you say, I'm only going to produce a perfect thesis, then you may not produce anything. So best to try to produce a perfect thesis, but maybe settle for producing a good thesis. And in particular, it's always possible to believe that you need to read just one more book or just one more article before you can write. That, there's this rather obscure text written 20 years ago in Iceland, which, is really, really crucial to my thesis. It may be, but there's always the temptation to put off writing in order to read some more. And I would advise you, it's best to get started as soon as you can. And realistically, your thesis is unlikely to be perfect. It only has to be good enough to pass an examination. It has to be good, but it can have faults, failings. There can be things you don't know, for example. And in line with this, getting anything at all down on paper is good. The waiting to achieve perfection in your mind before writing anything is bad. Saying, well, I know I'm not quite clear exactly what I'm going to say. My advice in those circumstances will be start saying it and see what turns out. If you doubt me, watch Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, where a man goes mad, allegedly trying to write a novel. Almost every thesis is substantial, and it takes some time to write it. And I think you need to break that time down into shorter and more manageable sections, not saying, I've got 2 years to write my thesis, or I've still got a year to write my thesis, or I've still got 6 months to write my thesis, or I've still got 3 weeks to write my thesis. That's the road to disaster. Break the time down into shorter and more manageable sections. So one of the key things you should do early in your career as a research student is agree a timetable with your supervisor. A timetable for each chapter, if you like, yes. I will produce chapter 1 at the end of March, chapter 2 at the end, won't be that order. I'll produce the literature review by the end of March, the methodology chapter by the end of April, the findings chapter by the end of May, and so forth. A definite timetable of when you will do things. That's quite easy to do. It's quite easy to sit down with your supervisor and agree when you will produce things. Much more difficult to stick to it. So it shouldn't be, 3 months or 6 months. Much better to have a timetable where where it's 3-4 weeks for a particular piece of work, where you can actually feel under pressure to produce something by a certain time. If you leave it for 6 months, chances are you're going to miss it. A chapter should be around 8,000 to 10,000 words. These aren't harsh rules. This, 6,000 words, 12,000 words, it's fine, but that's the advice of most people is 8,000 to 10,000 words, purely because if it's much longer, organization can get difficult. You start to get confused and it gets a mess. So I advise you in general to aim for chapters of around 8,000 to 10,000 words. The methodology chapter can be shorter. It's often not necessary to write 10,000 words on how on the strengths and weaknesses of constructing a survey. And the introduction and conclusion will normally be shorter. You don't need to write 10,000 words of an introduction usually. So it's the substantial chapters that will normally be that sort of length. The next piece of advice is that I think you should expect to make multiple drafts. A thesis usually goes through several drafts, and it changes is focus as you write it. As you develop your arguments, as you detail things which seemed not quite clear before you started writing, the focus can change. It can change very substantially. You may be one of those rare people who, follows their initial idea without deviation, but most people are going to make at least some changes and some very substantial changes. Of course, you can't change your findings. If you've conducted an experiment and it's giving you a certain set of data, you can't say, "Oh, I don't like that data. I'm going to make up some more or find some more." But you can interpret them differently. So you can, even in the most, the most rigid of circumstances, you can go through changes of interpretation. When you write the first draft, don't worry if it doesn't make much sense. Your supervisor will certainly tell you if it's nonsense. So, and you will change it, and you'll change it, and you'll change it. And I think that some theses only go through 2 drafts. Some go through half a dozen. I don't know what your situation is going to be, but expect to redraft, expect to reorganize. And this is very basic practical advice that I will come back to again and again. Make sure you make backups of your drafts. Ideally, you'd have 3 backups, 3 copies of each draft. Sorry, I should say draft. One on your PC, one on a local disk, and one in the cloud. That way, your PC breaks down, you've got another local one. If your house burns down, you've got one in the cloud. That's the standard advice that every IT department will give people. And because the thesis is such an important piece of work, because it's 2, 3, 4 years of your life, make sure you back up. The last thing you want 1 month from completion is to lose your entire draft because your disk has gone down. If you're going to keep several drafts, label them distinctly. I have this problem that I go through drafts of articles and find it difficult to remember which one is the most recent one. So label them distinctly if you intend to keep them. The parts of the thesis, as I said, it's a long-term effort. Hardly anyone can sit down and write 60,000 words in one go. Some popular novelists have done that. I've never heard of anyone being able to do that for a PhD. Maybe some geniuses somewhere can, but most people can't. It's a cumulative work. It's something you build over time, and therefore it needs to be broken down into manageable chunks. And you need to set yourself manageable targets. The timetable is the most important part of that, but I think also organizing how you're going to organize your writing is an important part of that. There isn't a fixed shape to a thesis. A thesis doesn't have to be A, B, C, D, but a conventional starting point, an easy starting point is, and this is, I suppose, largely derived from social science ideas. First of all, an introduction, then, if necessary, background material, then the literature review, then the methodology, then the findings, then the discussion, then the conclusion. Those are, if you like, the crude skeletal shape of any thesis. You're not bound to follow that sort of structure, nor to follow that order of presentation. This is just the sort of the starting point. What you will find yourself doing will depend largely on your particular material. You'll modify this crude framework as you develop the thesis. In what order should you write things? Not in what order should you research things, but in what order should you write things? And my first piece of advice, and this is very definitely, never ever start with the introduction. What you're going to say will change as you write it down, and therefore the introduction you write at the beginning, at best, will have to be changed by the time you get to the end. And at worst, you will find yourself struggling to fit what you thought at the beginning when you wrote the introduction and what you are thinking now you're writing the conclusions, fitting them together. The introduction should be written last. You may not need background material. It's only needed if the thesis involves unfamiliar material, unfamiliar places, unfamiliar times. But that's sometimes necessary, but it's not a central part of the thesis. The literature review really is the thing you should be finishing first, in my opinion. It certainly should be finished early in your scholarly career. Theoretically, it should be finished before the fieldwork. If you don't know what you're going to look for, how can you go into the field and look for it? In practice, sometimes field work can lead to a different focus. You can find things that you didn't expect to find, and you have to go back and think again about the theoretical framework you're working in. I mean, one crude example from the past, when I was back in the 90s, before I went to Baptist, I had a PhD student from the United Arab Emirates who was going to compare the state-run paper with the commercially run paper. And she had agreement from both of the editorial teams that she could go and work in their newsroom. Just before she was going to go into the field, the ownership of the privately run newspaper changed, and the new owners would not let her go into their newsroom. So she really did have to radically revise what she was doing. She could no longer do a comparative study. She had to do a different kind of study. That's unlikely to happen to you, but nevertheless, that kind of change, some kind of change, can easily happen. After the literature review, the methodology chapter follows. And then findings and discussion. They may be separate or they may be done simultaneously. That's partly a question which can only be answered concretely. But it is the fact that these are the heart of your original contribution to knowledge. This is where, if you like, you'll pass or fail your PhD. So therefore, these require the greatest care, the greatest love, the greatest attention. Then you write the concluding chapter, and then you write the introduction. So that's my advice, is that's the order of writing. What are these things, all these titles mean? What is a literature review? Well, it's not a list. It's certainly not a list of all the books and articles you have ever read on your topic. Many students do simply list everything they've read. One paragraph on one article, another paragraph on another article, another paragraph on another article. That's not what a literature review is. Those are notes towards a literature review. The aim, what you're trying to do in a literature review, is to demonstrate the theoretical grounding of your approach. That this is a topic which you're addressing because it fits within the general theoretical framework of existing human knowledge. Yeah? And therefore, a literature review has to demonstrate that. So it's a reasoned discussion, not a list, a reasoned discussion of the current state of knowledge in your chosen field. And I stress the current state of knowledge. There are some terribly influential articles, which are now almost as old as I am. One that I can think of is Warren Breed, Social Control in the Newsroom. Yeah? That was written, I think, 1953. It's still very, very impressive, but it's not the current state of knowledge. Yeah? So if you can cite Breed if you wish, but if your discussion of the newsroom stops with Breed, then you're not reflecting the current state of knowledge. The current state of knowledge will be reflected in journals like Journalism Studies, Journalism, and so on, that whole range of contemporary publication. And you need to show that you know what the current state of knowledge is, that you're not, in other words, behind the field. One easy way to organize that, I think, is a debate in which you take sides. Yes, you say, some people argue blah, 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 other people argue blah, 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 blah. My own view is that blah, 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 for the following reasons. Yeah, that's an easy way. It won't fit everybody, but it's an easy way of doing it. So what you are doing is situating your own work within existing scholarship. It's to say, this is what we know already. And this is where I fit into it. So you have to demonstrate that you're familiar with the major theories and findings in your field. Not necessarily absolutely every last minor nook and cranny, but the major theories and findings in your field. So let's say, if you're writing about interactive culture, you'll certainly want to say something about Jenkins. Whatever you think of him, last 20 years, he's been very influential scholar in the field of interactivity. And you're also identifying the gap in knowledge that your thesis will remedy. Yeah? Because you make something, the state of knowledge is one thing, an original contribution to knowledge is another thing. And you have to show why your original contribution to knowledge plugs a gap in the existing knowledge. You're making an original contribution to knowledge. You need to specify the research questions you intend to ask. What I'm not, this is my general field is, I don't know, fake news in the coronavirus epidemic. But what specifically do you want to know about this? What research questions are you asking? They will show how you fill the gaps in current knowledge. We know blah, 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 but we don't know this. Therefore, I'm going to try and find out this. And the reader should, of this thesis, this literature review, should come to an inevitable conclusion at the end of it. The research questions you ask are well grounded, that you haven't just dreamt them up, that they're original, that you aren't copying somebody else or just reprising someone else. It is possible to write a PhD thesis replicating someone's work. That is the case, yeah. But you would have to, I would discuss that very carefully with your supervisor, because replication has a number of problems, not least of which you very often come to different conclusions. There's a replication crisis in the human sciences, and notably in psychology. People have said, this is a replicable finding, and actually it turns out it's not. The research questions you ask are well formulated, that they're going to address the question that you are interested in. And this is, I guess, the most difficult bit, that the research questions you ask are important, that we need to know this. In the more formal social sciences, it's normal to present hypotheses which you will test, yeah? And they will come as a way of testing the research questions. You need to show how they relate to the research questions, and you need to show how they're to be tested. So that's the shape of the literature review. It's followed by the methodology chapter. Every thesis has to have a methodology chapter. You have to show why you are doing what you are doing. It's also the part on which you'll get most questions in the examination. That's because come the completion of your thesis, you will be the world expert on the particular subject you're researching. One, perhaps more, of the members of your examination board will also be experts, probably not quite on what you're an expert on, but close, yes? So they can ask questions about all sorts of interesting things. Most of the people will have a general knowledge of what you've talked about, but they won't have a particular knowledge. They will have a pretty strong knowledge of methodology in your area, and so that's what they'll ask you questions about. And that just always happens. The methodology chapter gets interrogated, not because it's the most important chapter, but because it's the easiest one for the examiners to investigate. And your aim in the methodology chapter is to convince the reader that what you did fits the scholarly norms of your field, that your sample is correctly drawn, that your ethical behavior is correct, and so forth. Those norms differ broadly between the social sciences and humanities, and I'm not going to attempt to tell either group which they should do. But in general, it tells the reader how you intend to answer the questions you've posed, and if you've got hypotheses, how you propose to test them. And it gives the reason why you choose these particular methods. It identifies any ethical questions. If you're conducting a survey, for example, you're going to have ethical. I think actually all PhD theses require ethical clearance if they involve human subjects. I don't think anyone listening to me now is going to have animal subjects, which will raise another question of ethics. But almost most people in the social sciences and humanities, not so much in the humanities, interact with real live human beings, and you have to show that your research is not harming them. You know, if you're just reading books or watching movies, that's fine. You don't have to have ethical clearance. And as I think on the university's website, you can say, first question on the ethics thing is, does your research involve human subjects? If you answer no, then you're away. If you answer yes, then you have to show why your behavior is ethically correct. So it identifies the questions and show how you answer them. It specifies the method you chose, talks about, you know, why you chose this particular method, why it's a strong way of answering your question. And you also ought to talk about what the weaknesses are, perhaps at rather less length than the strengths, but nevertheless, you need to show the reader that you know the limits to what you have discovered. The findings and discussion, much more difficult to talk about in detail. It's the core of any thesis. It's the key part of the thesis. What you do in the literature review and the methodology are really only critically repeating what you've read. Yeah? You may have some element of additions, but you know, most of it is going to be other people. This is you. This is the material you have found, which is why it's the core of an original contribution to knowledge. It's much more difficult for me to be prescriptive about these. Different kinds of research impose different disciplines. In stricter social sciences, there tends to be a separation of findings and discussion. You tend to present your findings and then tell the reader what they mean. In humanities, other more interpretive approaches will tend to run them together. And I don't pretend to advise you about what your particular organization should be. But whatever way you go, clarity of presentation is essential. If you've got important tables or pictures or any other piece of data, use them. Make sure that every piece of data, every piece of material that makes your findings and your conclusions about findings clearer is used. If you're wildly over length, and this is probably one of the places where people do tend to go a bit over length, you can put the surplus in an appendix or an appendices. If you want to share your questionnaire, for example, you can put that in the appendix, because the appendix doesn't count towards the 60,000 words. So anything too long can go into an appendix. This material should tell the reader what you found out. For example, if you've got hypotheses which were supported, which were confirmed, what it means, how the findings answered your research questions, and why these answers are important. After reading it, the examiner should know what your original contribution to knowledge has been. This is where you present your original contribution to knowledge. The conclusions should not introduce new material. They summarize the question you've addressed. They summarize the methodology you used to answer them. They summarize the main findings and what they meant. They review at length how great your work is, and more briefly, but nevertheless, you have to do it, say, what are the limitations of my work? This is what I found out, isn't it wonderful? I wish I'd been able to find out something else, but that wasn't possible. And it points to the ways in which your work could be carried forward. Next, I'm going to, or the scholarly community could. And it tells the reader what a brilliant thesis they've just had the privilege of reading, and you know, what a clever boy or girl you are. And the introduction, which is written last, guides the reader as to what is to follow. It summarizes what the thesis is all about. It briefly discusses the theoretical issues addressed. It guides the reader through the structure of the thesis, and it tells the reader what each chapter contains. And the aim of the introduction is to demonstrate in advance what the reader is going to look at is coherent, that it all fits together. Yeah? And you can't really do that until you've fitted everything together. So that's one of the main reasons why the introduction should be written last. So what must you do? Do spell everything out in detail. Treat the examiners like idiots. Don't assume they know something. Tell them. Don't worry if it's simple. Don't worry if they actually do already know it. It shows at least that you know it. Do get a native speaker as editor. If you're writing in English, get an English-speaking editor. If you're writing in Chinese, get a Chinese-speaking editor. Get a native speaker, I would say. Because the better, I said, the English, the better the Chinese, if you're writing in Chinese, the better the reception. The easier it will be for the examiners to read it. The clearer your points will be. The more obvious the value of your work will be if people don't have to struggle with the language. Do make sure you have full scholarly apparatus. 1,000 citations are better than 100 citations. I know that this is just what scholars do. They cite other sources. So, lots of citations are worth more than few citations. You don't have to have 1,000 citations. I don't think I've ever seen a PhD thesis with less than about 200 or so. But anyway, make it as full as it possibly can be. And no one ever failed because of too many citations. Do make it as easy as possible for the examiners. They want you to pass. They're not a bunch of monsters who want to fail you after 4 years of work. They want you to pass. So help them to pass you. This is not entirely serious. Make sure you have favorable quotations for the works of your examiners and their pals. I mean, if your examiners are, as they should be, at least one of them an expert in the field, really, their contribution would be part of your literature review, whatever your view of it. Do make sure you follow the guidelines for the format of theses. They're very simple, very basic, but they need to be followed closely. Otherwise, you're going to get into trouble with the registry. The registry don't care about contributions to knowledge. The registry can't care about whether your margins are the correct width. So read them and follow them. And again, do make sure you have multiple backups, preferably in different locations, not all in one place. Don't open yourself to the charge of plagiarism. The university is very harsh on plagiarism. A student who is found to have committed an act of academic dishonesty, such as plagiarism, submission of materials for assessment which is not the student's own work, the use of fabricated or copied data for assessment, may lead to disqualification from the award of the degree or dismissal from the university. And plagiarism happens everywhere. I mean, there was 2 or 3 years ago, actually more than that now, about 6 years ago, there was a famous case where 100 students were thrown out of Harvard for plagiarism. So, it happens everywhere. But I would say that certainly at the PhD level, it's very rare for people consciously to plagiarize. Some people do. They try to pass off somebody else's work as their own, but that's very, very rare. But over several drafts, references can get lost. If you're writing 4 or 5 drafts, the first draft you think to yourself, okay, I'll put the reference in next time. And there's 100 references and you remember 90 of them, but 10 of them somehow get lost. And they therefore open you to the charge that you're, let's say, paraphrasing a well-known argument by a leading scholar without recognizing that. In other words, you're engaged in plagiarism. Don't say, I'll put the references in later. That's very, very common. I think people think, I'll put the references in later because it's a chore to type all the details of, the Journal of Communication, volume 53, page 77 to 80. I'll put it in later. I can't bother to do it now. I'd say very, very strongly, put it in when you use it. You can always take it out, but put it in when you use it. As I said, as the drafts develop, you'll certainly forget some. So better make sure you put all the details in the first time you use them. And then make sure they stay, for the various drafts. You will have to run your thesis through Turnitin, the plagiarism software. And your supervisor has to attest that you've done this, and attest that there is no significant evidence of significant plagiarism. And if it turns up any problems, you'll have to fix them before presentation. Don't skimp on the detail of the scholarly apparatus. Examiners invariably pick up on that. So on page 73, you put so and so and so and so. When I look at your list of references, I can't find so and so. Yeah? And it's just an organizational technical point, but it's bound to be picked up. And you really should make sure you get the details of the scholarly apparatus right. Don't cite things in the text that you don't have in the list of references. Don't put into the list of references things you don't cite in the text. Anyone can write a list of references. The question is, have you used them? And the only way you can demonstrate that is by using them in the text. And if you're going to quote your examiners, don't make the quotations too groveling. Show a degree of critical maturity and distance, even from your examiners. And don't forget to tell the registry 2 months before submission what your title is going to be. Yeah? Otherwise, they'll get nasty. And don't forget that your supervisor must approve your thesis for submission. That's a relatively new development, because in the past, sometimes students have been told they shouldn't submit theses and have just submitted them anyway and failed. So I would say that you must get your supervisor's approval. So who will read the thesis? Naturally, everyone will. It's going to alter the way we think about the world. It's going to inspire future generations of scholars, and it will be published as a groundbreaking book. Of course, that's what your thesis is going to be like. But first, you have to pass the oral examination. So don't worry about your great reputation in 10 years' time. Think about the oral examination after you've completed. And that means the most important readers are the examiners. You're writing for the examiners, not for yourself, not for the world, but for the examiners. One important thing about examiners is they will all have too many other things to do. They'll be pressed for time, and they will want to read the thesis as quickly as possible. In the UK, the joke is that the external examiner reads your thesis on the train to London. Yeah? That joke won't work in Hong Kong, because not even from University MTR station to Kowloon Tong is not. It doesn't take long enough to read a thesis, even a short thesis. But they want to get it done as quickly as possible, in between many other things, in between supervising their own students, giving undergraduate lectures, writing their research paper, sitting on the university senate, blah, 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 blah. So they want to be able to get through it as quickly as possible. For you, this is a life-defining moment. This is going to shape the future of your life. But for them, it's just another chore, something they've got to fit into a busy timetable. So think about what they need. You have to help them get through the thesis and get through it quickly. So that's why you would need to give them good overall guidance in the introduction. This is what you are going to see. You're going to read about so and so and so and so. This is the methods this is the theory that's going to be deployed. These are the methods that are going to be used. This is what chapter 1 says, blah, blah, blah. And remind them of that guidance in the conclusion. And do the same for each chapter. Yeah? Introduction, in this chapter we, blah, 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 blah. And then the summary, in this chapter we have. And it sounds very mechanical and routine, but it guides people. It helps them understand the shape of the thesis, how it fits together, what's really important about it, and so forth. And you should show them how the chapters are linked. So, thinking about your readers. The readers will constitute the board of examiners. This is what the university regulations say, shall consist of 2 external examiners and 2 internal examiners, including the head or designate and 1 academic in a research field closely aligned to the candidate's research. The dean of the relevant faculty or school or designate shall chair the board, casting deciding votes only. The department head designate shall be a senior academic of the department, and the dean's designate shall be a senior academic of the university. In cases the department head or the dean is principal supervisor of the candidate, a designate must be appointed to serve on the board. So the board of examiners consists of other people. It doesn't consist of your supervisor. The supervisor is not allowed to be a member of the board of examiners, and that's obvious reason that to ensure there's no favoritism. Your supervisor, however, can be there. Sometimes think about the prisoner's friend. The supervisor of the candidate being examined shall be invited to have input in the question of the candidate, but shall not be included in the vote taken by the board of examiners. So they can be there and they can ask questions, and usually those questions are supportive questions, but they can't vote on the outcome. Usually you can discuss with your supervisor who should make up the board of examiners, and usually the dean will follow the advice of the supervisor when nominating people to be on the board of examiners. So I think it's a very important discussion. Who are we going to have? The internal examiners, the external examiners, and the principal supervisor all have to read the thesis and produce a written report before the oral examination. The registry, I couldn't find the current regulations, but I have regulations as to how long you need to give them. It's usually some ludicrous thing like 3 months or something. You can usually negotiate. If the examiners are agreeing to do it more quickly, the registry will usually give way, but usually at least a month, and often rather longer. You're not going to be examined immediately the day after you submit your thesis. People have to read it. They have to write reports on it. The external examiners, they must not have had, or be about to have an association with HKBU. So if I'm no longer employed next year, I can't be an external examiner because I will have had an association with HKBU. They can be senior academics from other institutions, usually are, or senior professions. They must be familiar with your research field, and they must have a record of research and publication. Usually external examiners come from other Hong Kong universities, usually from Chinese and City. That's where the external examiners come from, and our people tend to be external examiners for them. But you can have an external examiner from an overseas institution. That's encouraged by the regulations. And given that Hong Kong rewards people relatively generously by international academic standards, you'll probably be able to find someone. If they can't attend in person, and very few people who, let's say, live in the Midwest are going to fly to Hong Kong for a one-day examination, they can participate online, or they can nominate a proxy. In practice, the external examiners are usually the people who make the decision. Not invariably, and not necessarily, there's not necessarily much of an argument. But if there is a quarrel, the tendency amongst academics is to defer to the external examiner. So the person of the external examiner is extremely important to you. And you need to choose them very carefully. You need to be pretty sure that this person, and you need to talk to other people. I mean, there are some people who seem extremely well qualified to be external examiners. I can remember one from someone, well, actually when I was in Westminster, who just was a complete shit. Just behaved disgracefully. We certainly wouldn't invite him again. And if anyone asks, I'll say, oh, no, you shouldn't have them. And some people are really just unpleasant about it. Other people are very much more positive. So, so ask around about what the record of these people is. you will be orally examined. You are obliged by the regulations to attend in person. And as you know, here you have got to have finished everything else. The examination will begin with you begin with some introductions, but then you make a presentation of your work. That should be about 20 minutes, but check with the board chair beforehand. He or she may allow you a bit more time, which most people want a bit more than 20 minutes to present the result of 3 years' work. The examination is supposed to focus on the subject matter of the thesis, in particular the quality of research supporting it, the field of study encompassed by the thesis, the originality of the research, the written and oral presentation of the research results and conclusions, and contribution of the research to the field of knowledge. That's pretty comprehensive review of the work that you have done. And in part, at least, that is what you will get. As I said earlier, you'll in practice get a lot of questions about methodology. That's something that examiners default to. The examination will certainly last an hour and probably considerably longer, 1.5, 2 hours, even longer possibly. It's going to be a very thorough investigation for your thesis. At the end of the examination, you'll be asked to leave the room while the examiners discuss their decision. Your supervisor can remain in the room for that meeting, but they can't vote, but they can listen to the discussion. And I would guess that in practice, they tend to have a voice in the discussion. They don't vote, but they tend to have a voice in the discussion. And you should try to persuade your supervisor that their main role is to insist that the Board of Examiners formulates its findings in writing before the end of the examination, because it's very easy for 3 or 4 elderly academics to sit around and say, oh yes, well, I think this thesis should be revised in several ways. For example, the blah, 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 the blah, 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 the blah, blah, blah. If they have to write it down, half of those blah, blah, blahs will disappear because they can't be bothered. So it makes them, tends to make them have fewer objections to the thesis, and it tends to make those objections more precise rather than a general thing, which it's very difficult to respond to. So try to persuade your supervisor that that's their major role, or a major role. What decisions can they take? They will summon you back, and the chair will tell you what they have decided. Naturally, you're going to satisfy the Board of Examiners, as the phrase wonderfully goes. We always used to roll around when I was at Oxford about the satisfying the Board of Examiners in all parts, which sounded a bit too demanding. Candidates who have fulfilled the requirements of candidature and coursework, submitted an acceptable thesis, satisfied the Board of Examiners, shall be recommended to the Senate for the conferment of the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. Naturally, that's going to happen to you. But possibly you might not quite satisfy them. And then they have 4 options. In cases where a candidate has failed to fully satisfy the examiners or the Research Postgraduate Studies Committee, the candidate may be required to resubmit the thesis with minor revisions as required by examiners, together with a summary of changes made to the revised thesis. After the revisions are approved by the chair of the Board of Examiners via the principal supervisor, the final thesis should be submitted to the graduate school within 3 months. Or they could be required to submit the thesis with substantial revisions as required by the examiners, together with a summary of changes made, blah, 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 principal supervisor, the revised, blah, blah, blah. They may be required to undergo a further oral or written examination within 6 months, or be deemed to have failed in the candidacy. There is one other option open to the board. Under exceptional circumstances, the Research Postgraduate Studies Committee has the discretion to recommend the candidate be awarded the degree of Master of Philosophy. In other words, this isn't quite up to the standard for a PhD, but will give you an MPhil. What do these decisions mean? Well, it's quite rare for candidates to be awarded the degree outright. I have to say I was. If you are, start celebrating straight away. But it's rare. Most theses require minor revisions If you're told this, don't worry. Minor revisions are the norm. Yeah, you'll be told verbally at the examination the revisions you must make, and you should get the detail in writing within 14 days. You have 3 months to make the revisions. Most people take nowhere near that long. Many do it in a week, because minor revisions are usually very, very minor. Some theses require substantial revisions. You'll need to do some serious work for these. You'll be told verbally what you must do and get details within 14 days. And you have 6 months to make the revisions. And in this case, you're going to have to seriously do some work. I've never known a case in which all that's required is a second oral examination, but it could happen in theory, perhaps with the addition of the resubmission of substantial revisions. It is very, very unusual for anyone to be failed outright. If you've got this far, you're almost certain to pass. I can't think of a single case of someone who's been failed outright at the Viva. It's also very unusual for anyone to be awarded an MPhil instead of a PhD, but it certainly can happen. It happened to one of my students some years ago. And you have the right to appeal against any decision you believe to be wrong. If you were awarded an MPhil instead of a PhD, you would say it's my supervisor's fault. They didn't give me the correct advice, and therefore I should be given another chance, or something like that. Yeah. What the university will say is another question. So those are the various decisions that you can get. Probably most of you will get minor revisions. Some will pass outright. Maybe, unlikely but possible, some will require substantial revisions. It's very, very unlikely that anyone will be failed or be awarded an MPhil. So finally, and I seem to have managed to keep to time this time, the oral examination is the last most people will ever take. This is, you've had a lifetime of examinations getting here. This is probably the last you'll ever take. Pass this and you'll never have to face the stress again. Like all examinations, it has a strong ritual element. It's a rite of passage, like coming of age in Samoa or whatever. And because it's a rite of passage, the examiners will ask you merciless questions. They'll be very, very tough, but underneath they want you to pass. They have to convince themselves that they've given you a hard time, that they've really examined you. And the reason they do that is that they're admitting you to the company of scholars. You're joining them as an equal, as someone who, like them, has got a PhD, someone who, like them, has proved that they can do original independent research, and who, like them, has made an original contribution to knowledge. So they have to convince themselves that you deserve that. Not all examiners are wonderful. Some behave like idiots, as I said. Some are con artists and so forth. But whatever, even if it looks as though they haven't actually read your thesis, treat their questions with the greatest respect. They are making the decision about your future. Whatever you really think about them, thank you for that. If you're thinking, God, he hasn't read page 37. Thank you for that question. That's a very, very interesting and valuable point. I attempted to cover this on page 37 and blah, 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 yeah? Whatever you really think, treat them with the greatest respect. And don't panic. You're almost certain to pass. Few people pass unconditionally. It happens, but it's very rare. Don't worry if they ask for minor corrections. You've done okay if they ask for minor corrections. Yes, you would prefer to get an unconditional pass, but likely you'll get minor corrections. Very unlikely you'll get anything worse than that. Maybe major corrections, but that's beginning to shade into impossibility. Hardly anyone ever fails. Worth remembering. And if someone does fail, their supervisor shouldn't have let them submit their thesis. So if the supervisor lets you submit your thesis, then you're almost certainly going to fail. I pass. Pass. Okay, that's it. Let's open the floor to questions if anyone wants to ask questions.
Hello, Professor. Can
Yeah.
you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question about the citation. You just mentioned that as much as citation as possible, but when I see those like thesis or paper, they have a lot of citation. That the author really read all of them, or they may just cut a few, like part of them to cite.
What a cheeky question. It's a trade secret. To be honest with you, I think what happens is that many papers that are cited, both in other papers and in theses, the person citing them has read the abstract. Maybe they've read the introduction and the conclusion. That's naughty. People do it. The worst thing to do is to cite a paper which doesn't say what you say it says. If you say, I don't know, all authors who have discussed the topic agree that the impact of market forces on the Chinese press has been liberating. Brackets, Wang and Sparks. Actually said the opposite of that. So yes, we've written on this subject, but what we said was that that was true 20 years ago, but it's less true now. I would say my advice would be, don't cite material that you haven't looked at. Yeah. I'm obliged to say you should have read it, but I'm also recognizing that some people, under the pressure of time, really don't read it as thoroughly as they should. So I think that that's a very, very hesitant and evasive answer to a very central and important question, but I can't be any more explicit than that, I think.
So it's like an open secret.
Don't embarrass me anymore.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. May I ask another question about citation? For example, if I read one paper and I found some sentences, like some argument that is really interesting, but the argument is not what the author want to major arguing in his paper. May I cite that?
Oh, of course you can. Yes. As long as you're citing accurately, you don't have to cite the major argument in a paper. As long as some people say much more interesting things as asides than they do in their main argument, and you can use that. And you perhaps want to say, as Smith argues, or as Smith says, although it is not his main point, blah 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 blah. Yeah. So you can certainly do that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Professor Song. I have a quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Sparks. My question actually stems from the idea of this very invisible crown that we all have of making outstanding contribution to the field of knowledge. And once, a professor very jokingly said that students start with the idea of getting an Oscar and end up settling with a municipality award in their final thesis. Well, but so to balance that pressure of making an original contribution, especially when there's not enough material available related to the field of research that you're working on. I mean, no research is completely original research, But to what extent are we allowed to flirt with what is happening in the rest of the world, at the same time trying to make an original claim, if the question makes sense?
Well, unless you address the knowledge which is already in the public domain, if you're going to write, for example, about press freedom in Singapore, you are going to have a senior member of Baptist, namely Professor George. You're going to have to cite his work, yeah, because that's one of the fundamental pieces of our knowledge about Singapore, yeah. You don't necessarily have to agree with him. Maybe you'll say no, as Lee Kuan Yew said many years ago, blah 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 blah. But if you're going to talk about press freedom in Singapore, or indeed in quite a lot of places, Professor George is going to have to be one of the people you cite. So you're going to have to cite existing knowledge. You're going to have to show you understand the existing state of knowledge. You're going to have to show that you understand how what you're thinking about fits into the existing stage of knowledge. You may want to disagree with everything. You may want to say everybody else previously has been wrong. Yeah, some people have done that. Albert Einstein, for example, and maybe you. But I think that it's absolutely central that you must situate yourself within the existing frame of knowledge. But you must also say something that isn't in the existing frame of knowledge. You must make an advance. Yeah? So let's say, for example, you were working on contraflow. Yeah. Certainly, you would have to address the fundamental work of Professor Thusu on this question, yeah, because he's written a number of major texts on that. You'd have to be familiar with them and show you were familiar with them. But maybe things have changed since he wrote what you're citing, and you can say something that this was great as far as it went, but things have changed since then, blah 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 blah. And you don't have to be saying contraflow is wrong. Just saying the world has changed a bit since then. So I mean, I think don't worry about getting an Oscar. Just worry about I mean, I'm with Voltaire on this. The best is the enemy of the good. But you have to pass an examination. You're not trying to prove that you're the most wonderful person in the world. You're just trying to satisfy the examiners. But you must have a grounding in the existing state of knowledge, and you must make some original contribution. Often it's very small indeed, but the point you're being examined on is your ability to make an original contribution, not to make a big original contribution or a broad original contribution, but an original contribution, because that's what shows that you are an independent scholar, that you're capable of the work. Yeah? And maybe next time around you'll stumble across, or not stumble across, no, you will discover something of fundamental importance. But what the examiners are concerned with is to say, yes, this person, like me, is capable of independent scholarly research, and basically that they're eligible to teach in a university and to conduct university research.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Could I just come back on something that was asked last week by Mr. Kumar, I believe, who asked me whether the Academy was a Ponzi scheme, multi-level marketing scheme, I believe, it was you who asked me. And I was thrown at the time because it hadn't occurred to me. And I've thought about it quite a lot since, and I think it's not a multi-level marketing scheme. Yes, of course, there are crooks in academia, people who do all sorts of naughty things. But the institution itself is certainly not multi-level marketing. A university has two social functions. At least in my view, it has two social functions. One is to transmit existing human knowledge. That's very clearly the case with undergraduate students. That tomorrow's doctor, tomorrow's broadcaster, tomorrow's school teacher gets the material the material basis for their activity from a university. Traditionally, as an undergraduate, increasingly as an MA student. So that's one way in which what we do is real, that we transmit existing human knowledge. Now, you can argue that some bits of human knowledge are more important than others, and I certainly agree with you. But the project as a whole is transmission of existing knowledge. But it's also, at least in the university sector, it's also the development of original knowledge, the advancing of human understanding of the world, of society, of the universe. That's one of our jobs, and that's a real development. That's something that really matters. So we're not engaged in a Ponzi scheme. We're not engaged in hiring people, in trying to get people to do what we do in order that we can pay back the people we originally recruited. We are trying to this is maybe some individuals are engaged in this activity, but what we're trying to do is to transmit existing knowledge and to advance knowledge, and that's those are two real things, and they're clearly real things. There is a market for I want to be crudely capitalist about this. There's a colossal world market for undergraduate degrees. There's a big world market for postgraduate degrees. And there's huge pressure on the admission to PhDs. People really want these things. We're, if you like, crudely, we're the McDonald's of scholarship. People really want McDonald's. They can pay money for them. Not me, but millions of people around the world. There's a real demand for McDonald's. There's a real demand for education. There's a real demand for research. So it's not a Ponzi scheme. Sorry, I didn't answer that last week, but I thought I should this week.
So just to put it in the context, it was not me, Professor.
Sorry.
And also I want to.
Who was it? Come on.
Sorry, it was me. I'm sorry, it was me. And I was hoping you'd take one for me, but thanks for
Okay, well,
thank you for remembering this. But I still I'm sorry. I know it sounded very cynical. I thought I could get away with it because I was just thinking about typing it in the chat, But okay. I understand it's not so black and white, but yet again, the last time when we were talking about how, and there have been some workshops similar to this, right? And it's never at any point talking about this kind of altruistic idea you're talking about right now, about this knowledge and this need for knowledge, but at the same time there is always this kind of capitalistic annotations involved, there is a market for this, and this is what kind of starts making it feel like, what you have to be sneaky about, not what you're trying to say, but how you say it, because, and also I see there is so much that becomes another kind of completely different domain of how radically or how politely you can say what you want to say and what is accepted in academia and what is not. But this is why I thought I had this feeling, and I know it's, I'm not very skeptical about it. I have this feeling that sometimes it does feel like an MLM. Every time you're sitting in this workshop about how to be an academic, it starts feeling like, you bring this many citations, then you get this many citations, and that's how you keep climbing the ladder. And ultimately, but I agree with a lot of stuff that you say. And also last time it wasn't so clear because last time when you were trying to tell me, I'm like, that's kind of an intellectual MLM. It's very sneaky multi-level marketing. It is, but you won't notice. But I agree with what you said today. makes.
Although universities are not McDonald's, they do operate in a capitalist society, and that logic permeates almost everything that we do. A state-run university, a state-financed university like Hong Kong Baptist University, is to a certain extent insulated from the market pressures, but we still have to respond to those. I should say, Hong Kong universities are amongst the best supported in the world. Maybe Singapore is better, but the combination of a successful economy and a Chinese respect for knowledge has meant that the Hong Kong universities are very well provided for. Now, when I came to Hong Kong from the UK, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. When I was in Westminster, the head of department, which is a department with about 40 or 50 members of staff, with about 800 students, perhaps more than that, had the services of half a secretary. Everything else, stuffing envelopes, making photocopies, blah, 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 all of the non-academic work he had to do it himself. I come to Hong Kong and I run the doctoral program. I didn't actually run the doctoral program. I was director of the doctoral program, and it was run, this doctoral program with 40 students or so, was run by a full-time administrative assistant. All of the things that you mean you'll do photocopying for me? You mean I don't have to do these basic tasks? So this is a very well supported environment, and therefore it's possible both to teach well and to research. I think personally, I did my best work when I was at Hong Kong Baptist because I had the environment in which that kind of work was supported. Much easier to do research if you've got the time and energy to do it, because many of the other jobs are done by people who can do them better than me. And I think that Baptist is very well provided, and that we are relatively insulated from the pressures of the market, but they're there. Of course, some people, perhaps take advantage of the fact that we're insulated from pressures, but I think the research record, at least of the school, is evidence that we do use the resources that are available to make serious contributions to knowledge. I'm sorry, I'm getting a long way off the point. I'll stop there.
Since we only have a couple of minutes left, I think there is a question in the chat box for Colin.
Sorry, I never quite understand chat boxes. I have 3 questions in the chat box.
I think there's one question from Ahmad. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Someone is at my front door. I think it's Amazon. Can I just run downstairs and let them in? Sorry, I was mistaken. For some reason, I don't know where it was. I am Ahmed, 23 years and PhD candidate from Malaysia. I have little or no experience in research. My question is it possible to start writing when I have very minimal material? How soon should I start writing in between determining whether or not my material is enough? Okay, Ahmed. First thing I'd say to you is speak to your supervisor, because what they tell you is much more valuable than what I can tell you, because they know you, they know what you've done, they know what you're thinking about, they know much more about you than I do. Second thing I'd say is that you can begin drafting a literature review very early on. But the part of the process of producing the literature review chapter is actually reading all this stuff. Yeah, I don't know what your particular topic is, but let's say it's, I don't know. You're from Malaysia. Let's say. I see. There's another question. If you're from Malaysia, then let's assume that you're writing about, I don't know, the contribution of electronic media to the development of a public sphere in Malaysia. Now, that would be a perfectly legitimate topic to write on. What I would begin by doing is to if you like, to take notes on what is the public sphere, what are the arguments about the contribution in general of electronic media, what have people said about that situation in Malaysia. You begin to build up a much better picture of what is already known. I mean, I know there have been people who've written on precisely this topic, so there would be things to find. So I think I would say starting writing is not simply a question of beginning you're beginning, if you like, the very, very first draft, which is your notes on what you've read. And you can do that the day you open the first book. I mean, obviously, if you're, I don't know, I guess you're still in the early phases of your PhD, and you should concentrate on your coursework. But that's assuming that's all under control. Then off you go and read Habermas or whoever. I mean, I'm making this up in terms of you being interested in that subject. But whatever the subject is, there'll be fundamental texts in the field that you can begin thinking about on the day you arrive. Indeed, often before people arrive. I've got another question here from Mohammed Rahul Kabir. A general question. Originality or methodologically analytical rigorousness? Which do you like most, Professor, or important, so to speak? Anyone who's read my work will know that methodological analytical rigor is not one of my strengths. I'm not sure that originality is either, but I do like it. No, I think that it's I can give you the classic answer, which is it's a question of the middle way. It's a question of balancing originality and a methodological analytical rigor, and they're not necessarily in any way contradictory. Originality concerns if you like, the intellectual framework with which you approach a question. Methodological rigor implies the ways in which you the quality of the methods you use to answer the questions you're interested in. So you can have an original question and a rigorous answer, and that's not a contradiction. And I think both are important for a PhD thesis. It depends on the individuals, really. I mean, I guess some people tend towards wanting to be original. Others tend to want to be rigorous. But I don't think that a PhD asks you to choose. A PhD asks you to combine those two things.
Thank you, Omar. Yeah. So is there any more questions? So, okay, so if no more questions, thanks again, Colin. Yeah, so I think we all just spent a very lovely evening, and the talks are very, the talks really, I found it very, very helpful. I'm sure that our students will benefit a lot. Yeah, so we will look forward to seeing you next week, next Tuesday evening.
Yes, in a much more hesitant mood. Yeah. Because I know how you get people get PhDs. I'm not sure I know how you de-Westernize media studies. So next week. Yep. Okay. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye.